Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. We're going to use the plot line to unpack this text, and we are looking at specifically here the very well-known story of Zacchaeus. All right, here we go. Verse 1, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. This gives us our simple kind of background info on the text. Jesus entered the city of Jericho and he is passing through it. Jerusalem is over here. There's a road that connects it to Jericho over here. And Jericho is the last major city on the way to Jerusalem. And we are told that Jesus is simply passing through Jericho on the way to Jerusalem for the Passover specifically. So we'll go over to our plot arc and we'll just put in our first point to get us started. Verse 1, Jesus is passing through Jericho. All right. Verse 2, a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. All right, verse 2. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, and by the way, not just any tax collector, but the chief tax collector is there, and he is wealthy. Now, at this point, we should remember that a couple verses ago, Jesus told us that it was as hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven as it was for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. So Zacchaeus is not in a good spot in that manner of speaking because he is wealthy. He is also the chief tax collector, which is important. So far in the book of Luke, we've only seen tax collectors. We've not yet met a chief tax collector. Matthew, who we saw earlier, was a regular tax collector. A chief tax collector is the kind of guy that Matthew would have reported to. The chief tax collectors were the ones who actually went to Rome, had made the bid for the rights to tax their own people and give the money to the Roman Empire, and then they employed these other tax collectors. So Zacchaeus is, in this sense, kind of the ultimate traitor to the people of Israel, which is going to really play a big part in once we get to verse 10. But I'll just add that detail right now. As a chief tax collector, he is very much viewed as a traitor to the Jews. Okay? All right. Back to the text. We'll look at verse 3. He wanted to see who Jesus was. That's it. That's simple. He wants to see who Jesus was, but he's got a problem. Because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. You might remember from the previous section that Jesus is now surrounded by a crowd of people who have watched him heal the blind guy. Really, it's a crowd of people coming down from Galilee to Jerusalem for Passover. And if you're a short guy in the crowd, you are not going to be able to see who Jesus is. Now, we're not told why he wants to see Jesus, only that he wants to see Jesus. So one thing that I like to think about is why? Why does he want to see Jesus? And I think of maybe two reasons, and this is just my guesses. One, maybe Matthew knows Zacchaeus, right? And maybe Matthew has told Zacchaeus about Jesus, or here's number two, and this is probably more likely, is that he has heard that there is a tax collector among Jesus's disciples. That Jesus is a rabbi unlike any other because he was willing to bring a tax collector into his inner circle. And maybe that's why he wants to see who Jesus is. Everybody else, hates him for being the chief tax collector, but Jesus has a tax collector among his disciples. I want to see this guy. But because he's short, he can't see over the crowd, right? So we got verse 3. Now, Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, but is short. Verse 3, which is going to bring us to verse 4. He's going to climb a sycamore fig tree to see Jesus. Now, this is a little significant. He's a rich tax collector climbing a sycamore fig tree to see Jesus is pretty undignified. But it demonstrates for us his desperation, right? So what does he do? So he ran ahead, climbed a sycamore fig tree. And by the way that these trees look is that they have pretty low to the ground. The branches start to come off to the sides. And so they're fairly easy to climb up. They can get quite tall, but in America, we have oak trees that are kind of structured somewhat similar to this idea of a sycamore fig. But it's not like our sycamore trees in the U.S. with those little fuzzy balls on them and the bark that falls off. It's a different tree than that. So anyways, he runs ahead. He climbs a sycamore fig tree to see him since Jesus was coming that way. He knew the path that Jesus was going to take, and he positioned himself on this sycamore fig tree along Jesus's path. He is not going to let this opportunity pass him by. He's going to make sure that he gets to see who Jesus was. All right, now, verse 5. When Jesus reached the spot, right, the spot where the fig tree was, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. He gives him a command. Come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. I'm just going to put a quick highlight on that word today because it's going to come back a little bit later. All right, verse 5. Again, he looks up. He says, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. That's a command, which has got to be an awkward moment, right? Zacchaeus, he knows his name, even though they've never met before. He's Zacchaeus. I know who you are. Come down. I must stay at your house today. This word must could be translated differently. There are kind of different ways to render this must, but it is necessary would be another way of saying it. It is necessary that I stay at your house today. And again, we should start thinking of questions here. Why does Jesus have to be here? What is going on with this appointment? And again, we don't know how Zacchaeus or Jesus might know each other. It could be Matthew, but everything that we're seeing here looks like more of a divine appointment. That God has brought these two together, Jesus and Zacchaeus, for his own glorious salvific purposes. So back to verse 5, Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. All right, now we get to verse 6. Zacchaeus does not delay. He came down at once, so he immediately obeys. He says, come down immediately, and Zacchaeus came down at once. And Zacchaeus welcomed him gladly. And so in this way, Zacchaeus is very much different than, let's say, the Pharisees, who were always coming to test Jesus. Zacchaeus wants to see him. Probably never in his wildest dreams did he think that he would actually have Jesus in his house. I mean, after all, he's a chief tax collector. So when Jesus says, I must stay at your house, he comes down at once and he welcomes him gladly. He's so happy that Jesus wants to come to his house. Verse 6. Zacchaeus gladly welcomes Jesus. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, why is there even any tension building at all? And it really all comes back to this point that Zacchaeus is a tax collector and Jesus is a rabbi. And so every continuous moment of their interaction is adding tension and adding tension and adding tension to the story. And it kind of reaches a high point right about here. Verse 7. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Now, it's not immediately obvious whether they are still in the street or they are now in Zacchaeus' home. But based on this statement from the crowd that he is gone to be the guest of the sinner, we could assume that somewhere between 6 and 8, Jesus goes to Zacchaeus' house. And the people do not like this. They see this and they began to mutter. Much like today, but far more prominently, in the ancient world, if you were eating with someone, it's kind of an endorsement of who that person is. And so when people see Jesus eating with a tax collector, when they see him eating with a sinner, they are muttering. And this is not so much a mutter of jealousy as it is a mutter of judgment, okay? A mutter of judgment. Verse 7, the crowds mutter about Jesus going to Zacchaeus' house. All right? And then we kind of reach the high point of this story. Verses 8 and verses 9. Okay? Let's come back to our text. But Zacchaeus stood up, right? What the crowds have said is that Zacchaeus is a sinner, okay? They're saying that guy's a sinner. And Luke, as he tells the story, is saying, well, is that the right way to see Zacchaeus? Because this is what happens. After Jesus and Zacchaeus spend some time talking, Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now," right? Above, I'll just highlight this so you can kind of see it. Come down immediately. He comes down at once and welcomes him gladly. And then here in verse 8, this immediacy, here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And in addition to that, not only is he going to give away his wealth, but also, if I have cheated anybody out of anything, then, we could supply the then, so use the if then. If I have cheated anybody out of anything, then I will pay them back 4 times the amount. Remember when Jesus talked to the rich young ruler? This was the issue for the rich young ruler, that he had a hard time parting with his possessions. And Jesus says, it's so hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. But here we have Zacchaeus, who's not like the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler says he's obeyed the commandments. Zacchaeus is a sinner, right? He's failed. And yet his repentance and his faith is genuine. And we see it because we see the fruit of repentance. He's going to give away half of his possessions to the poor. He's going to do the thing that the other guy had so much trouble with. And his repentance about being a dishonest tax collector is clear as well. Because if I've cheated anybody, if I've done this extortion that I should not do, I will pay back 4 times the amount. So there's all this fruit. And this on all this guy who we thought was a sinner, right? So verse 8 shows us that because Jesus interacts with Zacchaeus, Jesus leads Zacchaeus into great repentance. And it causes us to wonder, is this sinner label the right way to see Zacchaeus? Or we could bring this down here. Is Zacchaeus really a traitor to the Jews? And let's go to verse 9 now. Jesus said to him, today, and that word today has come back. So let me bring that yellow back up. I must stay at your house today. And now, verse 9, today, right? There's this immediacy to everything here. Jesus says to him, today, salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. Back to our plot line. Verse 9. Zacchaeus has received salvation. That's one. And two, is a son of Abraham. Which connects back to the bottom, right? As a tax collector, he was the ultimate traitor to the Jews. As a sinner, he was so far from the kingdom of heaven. But what we see here is a rich man proven to be a son of Abraham, not only by blood, but also, most importantly, by faith, right? And you could always read up on Romans 2, 3, 4, about how a true son of Abraham also has faith, not just the blood or not just circumcision. And then also, right, this sinner label on him. Well, look at all this repentance in Zacchaeus' life. And this is just the power of Jesus, right? When we looked at the rich young ruler, Jesus said, hey, what's impossible with man is possible with God. And so what we're seeing at the high point of this is Zacchaeus' coming to faith, but also Jesus' power to bring salvation to those that we would never think could be saved. And now, coming back to the text, the last line is a teaching point for us all. For now Jesus unpacks himself, the Son of Man, which, remember, just before this, he called himself the Son of Man to the disciples and talked about the Son, everything that the prophets foretold about the Son of Man will come true. That's at the end of Luke 18. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost, right? And so now we have a whole new lens by which to understand this guy. Is he a sinner or lost, right? And of course, they're both the same thing, but quite important, right? That we have the heart of someone who is lost. The Pharisees and those confident of their own righteousness, they don't think they're lost. They don't think they're a sinner. They don't see their need. Jesus came to seek and save the lost, those who recognize their need of him. And it's why, the leper, it's why the blind guy, it's why the tax collector, all of them are getting saved and receiving salvation. But the Pharisees and the rich young ruler are not, because they don't think they're lost. And what we understand here at the end is the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And so we're wondering, what kind of people enter the kingdom of heaven? What kind of people has Jesus come to save? It's lepers, it's blind men, it's tax collectors. These are true sons of Abraham. And so we come to the final piece of this, verse 10. Jesus came to save the lost. And that is a beautiful, wonderful truth, and just an exciting little story of Zacchaeus' salvation. We should, from this and from the last couple lessons, realize that the blind man and Zacchaeus together form this beautiful picture of the heart we need to be saved. And by the way, if you were thinking after a couple weeks ago that, it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, right? It's so fitting then that just a few verses later, it's a rich tax collector who gets saved. Don't forget that with God, all things are possible. Even guys like Zacchaeus getting saved.